today here in the State House, we are in the Cedar Creek room, where we just today have installed a new exhibit here in the Cedar Creek display case. As is often the case, this is from the collection of Vermont historian, Vermont Civil War historian Howard Coffin, and the focus of this is on Brigadier General George J. Stannard. Stannard is also represented here in the State House with a bronze tablet that's in the hallway in the card room here, a large bronze tablet, and we're hoping that in a future episode here we can highlight some of those pieces. But specific to this exhibit, these are a couple of maps and a handwritten note related to Stannard during his time in the Civil War. He was one of certainly Vermont's great Civil War heroes, probably most well known for leading the 2nd Vermont Brigade at Gettysburg in 1863 on July 3rd. It was his brigade that helped break the southern flank of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg and really turn the tide and turn into a Union victory there. He was severely wounded there, and while he was recovering, he was actually placed in a less stressful command. He was placed in command of the New York Harbor defenses. And one of the maps we have in here, the largest map that we have in the case on display today, is a map of a portion of those defenses that was drawn specifically for Stannard. This is the fort at Willets Point that you see here in this map. And one of the things I think is incredible when we think about maps that were done at that point in time is every map was hand-drawn. So this is an incredibly detailed map that Stannard would have used, that he would have had, in his hand, looking over the defenses there. But again, if you look at the intricate detail of it, it's remarkable to me what map makers of the mid-19th century, and certainly before that, were able to do. So that's one of the pieces, and we do have another map here that we'll talk about as well. So the other map in this case is actually a map of Richmond, Virginia. After Stannard recovered from his injuries, he was reassigned to be back on the front line. He later commanded a brigade in the 18th Vermont Corps and led it in a massive, ultimately doomed attack on Cold Harbor on June 3rd of 1864. He was again wounded, but he did recover to lead a division in the Army of the James that on September 29th, 1864, captured strategic Fort Harrison in the Richmond defenses. And during that battle, Stannard actually lost his right arm as his men repelled a counterattack that had been ordered by Robert E. Lee. Now, the map that we're looking at right now was used by Stannard in planning the Richmond attack. Again, incredibly detailed and on an incredibly small scale. I don't know if the camera can pick it up, but if you happen to be here looking at this map, if you look closely, you can actually see pencil notations along the James River on this map that Stannard himself wrote on there where his troops crossed on the way to battle, which is, again, pretty remarkable and very interesting. This is an extremely detailed map of the Richmond area and as he prepared for their attack there, and again, in very small detail, very impressive map-making work. So again, Stannard was recovering. He had lost his right arm at Cold Harbor, had certainly gone through a number of fairly serious injuries during the war. He was reassigned again and recuperated in Vermont and commanded the northern border defense after the Confederate raid on St. Albans in 1864. We have a note in here that Stannard wrote. And one of the interesting and important pieces about this note, it was a note that he sent to Colonel Amos Tracy, who was actually awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroism at Cedar Creek. But the writing here is somewhat disrupted. He's struggling to write here because he's learning to write with his left hand because his right arm, he lost his right arm in one of those serious injuries that he did receive on the battlefield. So an interesting piece here where you see, if you were to compare it to his earlier handwriting, that he's completely learning how to write again using his offhand. So a really interesting collection of items here that Howard has shared with us for a little bit of time here, and something that are worth looking at. Again, these are original pieces that General Stannard would have held in his hand. Again, he would have used both these maps, both in preparing defenses for New York Harbor and preparing his attack on Richmond, and then again a more personal piece with this handwritten letter where he was learning to write all over again. So if you are in the State House wandering through the Cedar Creek room, I would encourage you to take 3 or 4 or 5 minutes and pop over to the case and give this really interesting collection a look.
I think one of the issues that we're following as the Attorney General's office is the issue of privacy, specifically digital privacy in terms of data. Data that is being bought, that's being sold, oftentimes unknown to Vermonters. And I think you look at what's happening in the European Union with the GDPR, which is giving more control back to the consumer. I think movement is afoot in this country, including Vermont, to protect Vermonters' online privacy. One of the bills we passed last year that was just took effect is the data broker law, which regulates third-party data brokers, which buys and sells Vermonters' data, oftentimes unknown to them, and certainly sells them to different companies. I think Vermonters have a right to know who's buying their data. I think they have the right to figure out what the opt-out provisions are. That's why that law required a registry with the Vermont Secretary of State for these third-party data brokers. I would encourage Vermonters to go to the Secretary of State's website to see who these companies are and figure out whether or not your data is being bought and sold, whether you're okay with that or whether you're not. I think this is about providing information and empowering consumers to make informed choices about who buys and sells their data. This is an issue of privacy. This is an issue of consumer protection. I think it also exists with students. We are supporting a bill this year that is a student online privacy bill with ed tech companies in our schools. I understand that we need to have kids who are tech savvy and can compete in a global digital world, but we also have to make sure that they're not being advertised to, that their data is not being collected, that profiles are not being created, and we are letting kids be kids and grow up in a world where they can learn, they can be nurtured, and they don't have to worry about being inundated with ads or being profiles being created of them. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Representative Jim Harrison. My district includes Chittenden, Killington, Mendon, and Bridgewater. I'm pleased to be here. I'm a member of the House Government Operations Committee where just like the name suggests, we get involved in a variety of different issues. Right now we're working on a couple election-related issues. And related to that are town charters. If a city wants to make a change, they go through a charter process and bring it to the legislature for a approval. And most of the time those approvals are granted because the voters locally had voted on them. Some specific interesting issues that are coming up right now are a charter change that's being proposed by the city of Montpelier, which would allow non-citizens, legal residents, but non-citizens to vote in local elections. They wouldn't be able to vote in statewide or federal elections because of constitutional preemptions. Additionally, the town of Brattleboro would like to change their charter to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in local and school elections. And obviously that has some ramifications because school funding, as we all know, is mostly shared statewide through our statewide education taxes. And if one town spends more, they pay more, but we as a state also pay more. So ramifications in what does it really mean? What does it add for uniformity? In the case of Montpelier, there are a number of issues that are raised. Do we say no to what a local town has voted that they would like to do? On the other hand, right now we currently have one statewide voter checklist, and that's the same whether it's for a state or a federal or a local election, and whether we want to deviate from that is a huge question. So we'll have to wrestle with that and try to come up with a way to go forward. There are many different opinions on that, and so we'll see what happens on that. But independent of all that, we're also doing a miscellaneous election bill, mostly technical changes. How do we encourage voter registration? What do we look at in that areas? Most of that, I think, is pretty uniform, non-controversial, and I'm sure we will get something done on that shortly. So hopefully this helps, and please feel free to reach out to any members of the committee if you have questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Patty McCoy, and I am a state legislator representing the towns of Poultney and Ira. And today I'm here talking about a recently passed bill, H-107, which is paid family leave. I voted against the bill. I did vote in favor of one of the amendments, which would have been a little bit more conservative than the bill that did pass out of the House. That bill would have given employees an opt-out if they chose not to put into the system. And I thought that way people who really weren't going to be able to take money out, such as myself, or people who have less than 1,000 hours in the course of a year. We're talking high school kids who may have a few hours after work to, have a job after work for a couple of hours. They would be mandated to pay into the system, but they would not be able to take out of the system for the paid family leave. I disagreed with that. I thought that if we put an opt-out in that, that would give people who really truly wanted to put into a paid family leave and get paid a certain percentage if they were having a baby or had to take care of a sick mother or father at home, they could. Unfortunately, that amendment did not pass, and ultimately H-107 did pass, which would cost employees approximately $80 million, and that's just on the low side. So that still has to go through a lot of machinations, going through the Department of Financial Regulation to see if we can even actually afford this. But that was one of the big bills. Coming up, this week's been fairly quiet. Coming up probably will be the marijuana bill, as well as the gun bill, and Proposition 5, which was the constitutional amendment on abortion, passed the Senate, and we will have a hearing next week here in the House from 5 to 7 on Wednesday, the 17th, and we will be dealing with that issue. Other than that, it's still snowing up here in Montpelier. I'm sure it is in the rest of the state too, and I can't wait for spring. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Good afternoon, Rick. I'm Chip Troiano, and I represent Caledonia 2 District, Hardwick, Stannard, and Walden. I've been a resident of Stannard for the past 45 years. So this year, transferred to the General Housing and Military Affairs Committee, and as a veteran, I had the opportunity to work on and report on the floor a bill that concerns the unclaimed cremated remains of veterans. I was approached earlier this session by another veteran who had asked if I would sign on to a bill which would allow the VA, the Veterans Administration, to inter and to mark the graves of unclaimed cremated remains. So we began to investigate it some, and we looked into it, and we found that we had no specific number as to how many remains that there were in the state of Vermont. There were considerable ranges from few to many. But what the thoughts of our committee was that one is too many. So under this bill, it allows unclaimed remains after 18 months, and while efforts are being made to contact relatives and people who may be able to take responsibility for these remains, absent those, we would be able to turn and verification from the Veterans Administration that these remains are an eligible veteran, and we will turn them over to the VA, and they will be interred, and they will be marked in the Vermont Veterans Memorial Cemetery. To me, it meant a lot, and we needed to do that, and I'm hoping that it will find its way to the governor's desk shortly. The other piece that we took up was of considerable interest to our committee. Not sure how much it gets out to the public, but this year we had the election of the Adjutant General. And in that process, we found that there was no real vetting process, that the candidates were able to spend short periods of time in the cafeteria with legislators to present their programs and their positions and various things. I was fortunate enough to meet with Colonel Knight, who ultimately won the election, who came to visit me in Hardwick one morning and had breakfast. I was able to talked to him for a considerable amount of time and determine what his positions were on things, how he would approach the job of Adjutant General, and ultimately gain my support. So what we propose under this legislation is that, which is moved to the Senate now, we would initiate a nominating board, much like the Judicial Retention Board. This board would gather information. Candidates would be responsible for announcing their candidacy to the board. The board would have access to information. They would interview the candidates and ultimately present to the legislature, to the assembly, that what their findings were. Not to make recommendations, but just to give information about where these candidates stand. And I think that keeping the election process is important, and I think informing the General Assembly of to where these candidates stand, what they stand for, and how would they approach the issues that the National Guard face is an important piece of making this election well informed by our legislators and hopefully have a better process. So those are the two pieces I wanted to talk to you about today, and thanks very much for having me.
Hello, this is Topper McFaun from the State House. I haven't been on for a while. I got cornered just a little while ago, so I'm going to give you a quick rundown of a couple of things. First thing is, we passed the child care bill out of our committee that is going to do a lot in terms of preserving the industry, allowing people to go to work and pay less money out of their pocket for daycare, and provide scholarships for those people that want to get in the daycare business in terms of being a teacher. And the reason for that is they make less money than people in the public school system. And we also have a loan forgiveness program that will be very intriguing to keep people in the industry. So that bill is passed our VAR committee. It's in the actually, it's in the House Appropriations Committee right now, I think. So, I mean, the Senate Appropriations Committee. So we're hoping that that's going to go through, and we'll have done something for working people in terms of their child care bill, and something for the industry as well in terms of those scholarships and loan forgiveness. So that's a big deal, and it's passed. The other thing that I want to talk to you about is the gun legislation that's going through now with the 24-hour waiting period. I am going to submit an amendment to that bill tomorrow that is going to try to exempt gun shows. There's about 40 of them that take place across the state, and they make a big difference on the economy of the places where they're held in terms of increased restaurant activity, motel activity, and we think that particularly in my area in Barrie, it makes a big difference. So we're going to try to exempt that. The other thing is we're going to try to exempt banquets that are run by fish and game clubs and so on, where they raffle off guns, and the person who brings the guns there does the background check right there, and they don't want to bring the guns back to the store and have somebody go to the store the next day or 24 hours later to pick the gun up. So we're going to try to do that, and one of the reasons with the banquet part is, from what they're telling me, a person who is thinking to harm themselves or others is not going to go to a banquet and try to take a chance on winning a gun to do either of those things. So there's two things that we're working on. There's a bunch of other stuff, and I'll try to get back on every once in a while and not have to get grabbed by the arm when I'm walking by. Okay, see you later.
Hi, I'm Senator Alice Nitka. I live in Ludlow, and I represent the 24 towns of Windsor County, as well as Londonderry and Windham County, and Mount Holly in Rutland County. And today thought I might talk about something you don't hear so much about, but maybe use, and that's the Department of Forests and Parks, which is part of the Agency of Natural Resources. They have let's see, I better look at my notes here on this. Their budget is $26 million, basically. They're level funded this year. All the departments are trying to stay within the administration's request with regard to not increasing their budgets beyond a certain percent, and they're all trying very hard to do that. It's not easy because, of course, there's cost of living, there's IT costs, in other words, all the digital software, all of that stuff which keeps going up, as well as their fee for space, which is the buildings that they rent or own and how much they have to pay into the state for the use of those. So anyway, those are some things they can't control. So they're fixed and they're given to them, just doled out to them as to their portion. The Department of Forests and Parks is an interesting place. Of course, it covers all the state parks, of which there are 55. And the state, they get money from, this is called, the state parks, what the money that they do is called a special fund. And then the department also gets some federal funding, and they also get let's see, I'm trying to think where the rest of their money comes from. Well, anyway, but the special funds, which is the state parks, and also includes logging in the state parks, and if there's logging that happens on state lands, it goes into a different division. It doesn't go to the state park special fund. But there are. Well, let me just go back to the parks. This is how they earn their money: from reservations for cabins and camping, also day use of the parks. Also, here's some minor money comes from firewood, boat rentals, things like that. And they may be raising the fee by $1 for camping. What do you think of $1 being raised? They're not raising the day use of it. They did that a few years ago. They're really trying to keep the parks affordable for all Vermonters and guests who come to them as well. Frequently I hear people say, well, they could charge more, which indeed, they could, but if people use them regularly with their family, of course they can buy a pass. So anyway, there's a lot of ways to use them. They're great. And they had, I think they had a tremendous amount of use this year. They had more than... They had, I think, a million some visitors this year, 1,900,000 visitors this year, which is a tremendous number, and so that's up about 100,000 from last year. So anyway, they're doing very well. They're also, in fact, really, some of the money that they take in is used for other parts of the budget because that's the biggest money maker for the agency. Some of the, that's okay. So anyway, they're getting their money from timber sales, as I mentioned before, and also the third big area, which is $2.5 to $3 million, comes from the ski area leases. In other words, if the ski areas are located on state lands, for many, many years now, there have been leases, as a matter of fact, going back to the time of Perry Merrill, who was involved, and I'm not sure, I don't remember what year this started, that he arranged for the ski areas to pay into the state. He was a forester with the state and started doing this. I can think of, we just changed the lease on Okemo this year. It has the lease, I think maybe for 40 years, but there are some new, the mountain sold to a different company. It sold to Vail Resorts, and so there are some new things that happened that were put in the lease. The old parts remain the same, but there are some new pieces that go in, and that some of the land is being used for different facilities now. In other words, they have a lot of summer activities now, and so there's a fee on some of those activities. You'll think of the better the ski areas do, the more money the state gets. So encourage people to go to your local ski area. The other thing that's going on, I'm trying to think, what else did I want to tell you about the forests and parks? I think that they have, about 600 miles of roads to maintain in the parks. So it's a big project. There's a lands administration division which also does a lot of work with writing the leases, also contracts for buying land, also if they're given land, and also how that's, all the work that goes into that in terms of title searches and all of that. They have their own division that does that. So anyway, that's a division you don't really hear much about at all. It's the commissioner is Michael Snyder, who has a goal of one day he would hope he could maybe have it so that anybody with a green license plate could get into the state park for free. I mean, that's probably not possible, but that's a long-term thought that, really keeping these open for Vermonters and the guests that come. The guests that come from out of state or wherever are not charged a high fee either. And I have some relatives that love to come and go to the state parks, and it's hard to get a reservation for if you want to rent a cabin or camping. You have to get in there early, and I think I forget when they open up the day when you can make a reservation, but I know it's like jammed that day because so many people love to come to the state parks. So anyway, I hope you go to one this summer. Thanks.